if at any moment, and the Jane will shout at me at any moment if the visuals are not working. Right. I'm talking about London, and I'm sure most of you are fairly well aware of London, but here to remind us all is a slide showing the City of London, which is the focus of our interest, sitting there on the banks of the River Thames and presently dominated by all those skyscrapers and monumental structures of the modern city. But they are, in a sense, why we've got so much to say about Roman London, because it's the construction of those stumps and towers that has created the opportunities for the archaeological investigations that give us the evidence I shall be talking to. And this is a subject I've been working on for rather a long time. Most recently with this splendid new book available from not that many good bookshops, but certainly available from OUP, who published it. And this is the culmination of some 50 years worth of research into London. I don't boast as many years on the subject as Harvey, but I'm chasing up behind, as it were. Having brought quite a few of ideas together in this book, it gives me something to present to you today and to talk about. There's quite a lot to cram in, and I have to confess that I've never succeeded in containing myself within the allotted hours, and the way I deal with that today is by fast forwarding towards the end, and I'll focus a little bit more on the early city because quite a lot of the interest lies in that area and quite a lot of our evidence lies in that area. But the key to our study of London is development-led archaeology and all of the excavations that have occurred on building sites. The picture you see as captioned is that of the Temple of Mithras, which is perhaps one of the more famous instances of development generating a mad dash of rescue excavation to recover evidence. But it is just but one of many hundreds, well over 1,000 detailed archaeological excavations that have happened in the City of London. And I would contend that after 450 years of looking at this site, this must rank as possibly in competition with Pompeii, but otherwise I would argue the most intensely studied archaeological site of the Roman and classical period that we have. And the great value of rescue-led archaeology is that it allows the full excavation of sequences. So although we have less of the plan to study and play with than we do in the case of sites such as Pompeii, we do have a fantastic wealth of evidence regarding the sequence of its occupation, the changes through time. And in there, we are also given the enormous benefit of some exceptional, seriously exceptional dating evidence. There are two strands to that. The most important of those, I would argue, is that of dendrochronology. And altogether, well over 1,000 tree ring dates have now been catalogued. And where we have the sapwood surviving, as we often do, we have precise felling dates for structures. And there's also some very good work being done by Damien Goodburn on the timber felling and procurement exercises. And he's shown that most of the timbers that we've recovered from archaeological excavations in London were used green, that this was not timber that had shrunk and had the shakes associated with aging. Green timber and timber used in construction activities in vast quantities had to be procured on demand. So therefore, when we have a date from a timber in London, there's a pretty good chance that that date is actually the date of the construction we're looking at, or within a very close time frame to it. Can't rely on that being the case in all instances, but it's a good rule of thumb that if we have a date, odds are it is the date of the construction we're looking at. But we ally that to and test that with the wealth of evidence we also have from our ceramic sequences. The Museum of London's catalogues, digital catalogues of data contain well over 1 million quantified ceramic assemblages from excavations on those thousands of sites in London. And in those ceramic assemblages, there are 230 odd different types of pottery fabric recorded. And each of those fabrics can be related back to a production site where we have good idea of when they were in operation and a good idea of when those kilns were supplying London. And that gives us phases of ceramic supply, which provide a 20, 30-year time frame, usually, sometimes a bit sharper in the later periods, a bit weaker, with which we can use to confirm and test the dendrochronological dating we have from London. So that combination of precise dating and extensive investigation gives us a remarkably good handle on the chronology of change and the nature of change in Roman London. And I would say an exceptionally understood site as a consequence. And when we're faced with this wealth of data and the appearance of many precise dates, and I'll be using quite a few of those as we go along, this challenges us to introduce the archaeology of London back into Roman history. When we know what's going on in AD 60 or AD 197, we can then talk about what we know is going on in the Roman Empire at those dates and why people may or may not have been building things in London at those dates. And one of the things that's emerging from the study of so many dated construction activities, waterfronts, drainage systems, public buildings, is how much the chronology of investment in London, in the City of London, in the Roman period, can be dated to periods where we know that the governors and emperors and procurators were interested in what was going on in Britain, and in particular phases of change that can be related to periods of advance in the conquest of Britain, or in dealing with the subjugation of rebellions at later dates, and whatever. And that gives us a fairly good feel for the fact that London is a creature of the imperial administration, and decisions being made against what is going on elsewhere within the province. And London had this very important role, and its port was vital to the supply of the Roman forces in Britain. And it's important to remember that Britain had a very unusual concentration of such forces. We have 4 legions based in the early period, and we also have a significant administrative infrastructure available. And that means that London is not only a creature of empire, but it is being populated by agents of empire and by the various merchants and craftsmen who come in the wake of the conquest to serve the needs of the province. And that makes it dominated by immigrant communities, certainly politically, and that we have fairly limited evidence for native Britons having an important role in the city. There are a couple of exceptions, but it is by and large the case that when we hear about people in London, they are from Gaul, they're from Germany, they're from Spain. And when we look at the osteological evidence and we look at where people grew up, as we can tell from isotopic evidence, there's again a significant proportion of people coming from elsewhere in the empire, and indeed beyond the empire. I mean, what some of the more exciting results from recent work on cemeteries in Southwark is to show that we actually have ethnic Chinese in Roman London, which I find a quite stunning discovery of recent research. Now, that combination of the role of London as a place in supply, that combination of its dependency on the administration, also makes it vulnerable. This isn't a city with a substantial native community to take the lead in affairs, and that when the empire is going through tough times, and wars and plagues are a feature I'll be referring to on occasion here, those do seem to have a particular impact on how London is being sustained and taken forward. And that in turn, the way in which we can shape and measure change in London as it goes through periods of shock and change is adding, I think, quite usefully to our understanding of how the Roman Empire itself changed. And I think London as a Roman settlement has a very important contribution to make now to our understanding of the Roman economy, the structure of Roman colonial authority, and how that changes through time, what goes on into late antiquity. Now, I may not have much time today to go into the detail of that, but I think that perhaps in questioning we can tease out some of those themes as well. But as I warned you, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the earlier stuff. And we start with the fact that London, as you can hopefully see at the center of this slide, in the pre-Roman period, is probably a borderland site. The River Thames itself was difficult to cross at most locations. And therefore, and as a consequence, it was quite often likely to have been used as a borderland, as a frontier territory, rather than as a unifying feature that it becomes when Britain is a united political polity, authority. And London really grows into importance when the river is a conduit for trade, when there is a bridge across the river that allows the different territories to its north and south to be unified. But if we look at it in the late Iron Age, our major polities, our major political centres are located elsewhere. Colchester, St Albans, Silchester, Canterbury, all have strong pre-Roman presence. And indeed, Colchester and Silchester were identified on coins as being the centres of political authority for late Iron Age kingdoms that are emerging in the period prior to the Roman conquest. London, however, sits on the borders. The slide you see shows London's site, no evidence there of direct late Iron Age antecedents, and you can see by the pottery distributions in Hatch or by coin distributions with the larger circles and triangles, that it does look to be close to a borderland between those different earlier polities. And that is both an advantage in terms of the Roman period, as the city can be used as a place for administrating and governing these different earlier territories, but is also, going back to my earlier point, an issue there as to terms of how you populate a city in an area without its earlier communities there to assemble to form local self-governing communities. That's the site of London and the background to it, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in a second on that. But we don't know about London. We have no evidence for London's existence until it enters history in Tacitus's descriptions of the Boudiccan Revolt of AD 60-61. And by splendid archaeological support, not coincidence, we have the small writing tablet from the recent excavations at the Bloomberg headquarters building, where the address Londinio is scratched onto the writing tablet, and that dates to the period immediately after the revolt. So we have both history and archaeology combining to give us the entry into history of the Roman site. But the site itself had been occupied for some years prior to the revolt, and we only know of the history of that site through the archaeological excavations in the city itself. Turning to that landscape where the City of London is located, this is broadly the situation we find in the late Iron Age period. We do have concentrations of activity, probably small farmsteads and settlements, but certainly ditches, the odd pit, features with finds in at the sites that I've marked on this map. St Martin in the Fields is one of the more exciting sites, and we'll be talking about that later on, but that's next to Trafalgar Square. The church in Clerkenwell is on a hillside location with a probable pre-Roman site, and certainly evidence in Bermondsey, some evidence on the other eyats in the Thames, and in particular, we can look at some of the work done in Southwark going back into 1980. Recent re-excavations of the site here, I think it's called Landmark House, but I've temporarily forgotten, have been producing some very exciting material, but that isn't yet fully in the public domain, and I shan't be speaking to that. But it does have pre-Roman activity, and some of that potentially leading into the late Iron Age, immediately pre-conquest period. But on the site where the City of London is founded, on the north bank of the river, we have no equivalent body of evidence to suggest that there was a farmstead of that date there. Some Bronze Age activity, but nothing of certain date in the period immediately prior to the Roman conquest. Now, this leads me into this slightly difficult place where we know that London has a Celtic name. The Latin Londinium is almost certainly derived from the Celtic Londinian. And recent research has suggested that one of the possible meanings of the place name come out of low-lying lands. Not a certain attribution, but a likely one. And low-lying lands does fit what we know is going on the south bank of the river. These eyats, Southwark, Bermondsey, shown on this map, are pretty close to the water level and are areas inundated occasionally. And these low-lying lands on the south bank of the river have our late Iron Age settlement evidence. And this for me is a very difficult confession to make. I'm a North Londoner. I live in Islington, was born in Islington. And to accept that south of the river might actually have an earlier and more important antecedents than our North London settlement is, for those who don't know Londoners will realise, is a difficult confession to make. But it does actually fit with the geographer Ptolemy, Greek geographer, who writes of Londinium as being a polis of the Cantoi. And I think there is some potential argument to say at least the place name derives from these settlements on the south side of the river that are there prior to the conquest. But these aren't urban sites. These are small scale. They're not producing the density of occupation that the later Roman city generates. And that leads us up into the conquest. And the Roman conquest is what brings London into full being. And here I've just shown the road systems and one of those prettier coins of Claudius with his monumental arch celebrating the conquest of Britain. And this has been a matter of considerable discussion and dispute with those students of Roman London. And there have been two primary hypotheses as to how London comes into existence following on from the Roman conquest, accepting that there isn't a pre-Roman city there, but identifying its origins as having to predate the revolt of AD 60-61. And these two can be separated into the fort into city hypothesis, and that goes all the way back to, I mean, the sorts of writings of Wheeler and prior to Wheeler, very popular during the 60s and 70s. And then that's the idea that there was a Claudian fort at London and the city emerged as a reused site where the fort had previously been established. A model suggested by what's going on, for instance, at Colchester, where we know Camulodunum has a pre-Roman site, there's a Roman legionary fort there, and the city, Colonia, is then established using the original fort site. That's one model. The alternative, and by far the more popular model in more recent years, has been that London started not as a military site, but as a civilian foundation, a place where merchants had gathered to support what the Roman administration was doing, but operating together, perhaps forming local self-government on their own account. And this fitted with a model of the city as being a hub, a hive of entrepreneurs, having a creative role, having agency in the process, rather than simply being yet another Roman military site where, oh yes, it's the Roman army who do everything. And this became the dominant model in interpreting what was going on in London throughout the 80s and 90s, and seemed to be supported by several decades of looking for and failing to find any trace of a Claudian fort out of which the city could have been built. And I just show here a couple of finds of military artifacts from London that were used in both sets of arguments. There is no doubt that there is a military presence on occasion in London later on in the Roman period. So that was our dominant model up until fairly recently, until excavations in the early 2000s on the site of the Walbrook, that's just next to the Bloomberg headquarters building, came across this double-ditched enclosure, the west side of a double ditch, a large inner ditch and a slightly narrower outer ditch, Ian Blair standing towards the wider ditch, leading the excavations here at the Walbrook. This, once found, drew our attention back to two sets of evidence. One of them is a paper by Rafe Merrifield and Harvey Sheldon, which had suggested where a Claudian fort might be located in the City of London, should there be one there, and had used the later Roman street pattern to model a likely circuit of the defences, arguing that only the ditches would survive of a fort of the conquest period. And this is pretty much exactly where they said the western side of that enclosure might be found. And a quick retreat to the archaeological archives of earlier excavations identified that we also had a double-ditched enclosure found at Bishopsgate, the site ETA 89, on the north side of Cornhill. The Bishopsgate site undated. So just a double-ditched enclosure. Some had thought that there might be defences associated with the Boudiccan period. And further to that, excavations at Regis House, yet to be published, but I've had sight of the pre-publication draft. It's pretty close to going as an online publication. And excavations there by Trevor Brigham and Bruce Watson identified a ditch, and intriguingly at the end of the ditch, a series of post holes, and that's shown at the bottom left of this slide. And those post holes looking very much like the sorts of structure you'd find associated with the gateway. And these also are Claudian in broad date. None of these ditches are precisely dated, and we have no clear and certain evidence of occupation in the period between 43 and 48 AD. But one has to remember that if there were a military presence in London at this date, it would have been a very short-lived encampment. And this takes us on to what we know of the history of the conquest. And the history is largely that written about by Dio Cassius, again, a later source, but drawing on earlier materials. And Dio describes Aulus Plautius, the leader of the conquest forces, reaching the Thames, crossing the Thames in combat by bridge. And quite how and why a bridge comes into being at this site is a matter to ponder. I would suggest perhaps a pontoon bridge built by the armed forces themselves. One could argue there might have been an earlier bridging site of the late Iron Age. But this is the site where the Roman forces, somewhere on the Thames, awaited for Claudius to arrive and lead in person the advance on Colchester. And we know from the sources that Claudius, when he arrived in Britain, only stayed in the province, as it was about to become, for 16 days. This was insufficient time for him to have arrived on the south coast and covered the land up to London. So he almost certainly would have arrived by boat with his supporting forces and elephants he is allegedly bringing with him, siege towers and the like. And the likelihood is he would have arrived to where the army was waiting for him somewhere on the banks of the Thames. Now, the map you should see in front of you shows a slightly later situation in the later 40s, showing the road system revolving around the later bridge at London or ferry at London. But as you can see from the lighter blue, which are the tidal flats and marsh areas and the intertidal areas, there are very few sensible locations to bridge and cross the river until you come upon these eyots of higher ground at Southwark, which form a stepping stone, as it were, towards the North Bank site where London was later founded. And so the argument has to be, given that description by Dio Cassius, given what we know of the archaeology of early London, this would seem the likely and sensible spot for the bridging point to have occurred. We don't know this for certain, but it's a strong argument that draws on both historical and archaeological sources. But sadly, because of the short lifespan, we're talking about a few weeks in AD 43, the short lifespan site means there's very little that one would ever discover in terms of finds and dating material from wherever it is that Aulus Plautius parked his troops waiting on Claudius in AD 43. So that brief-lived site we know little about, beyond the possible identification of its defensive circuit. Where we come onto more certain grounds is in describing the later history of the site, and the earliest closely dated structural activity dates to circa AD 48, and this comes from the dendrochronological dating of some of the engineering of the road system leading to the site of London. In particular, these timbers from One Poultry provide a close date. And what's fascinating is that we have two phases of major construction activity going on at this rough period, one dated to circa AD 48, when we have the layout of the roads reaching the site of the city. But then we have the town plan being properly established in circa AD 52. Several excavations have shown a complete reorganization of the street system in that early 50s period. And so something big has changed at these two dates. And my tentative suggestion, and this is only a hypothesis for future testing, is that what we have going on in AD 47, 48 is a reuse of the early military site as a supply base for campaigns occurring at that date. But the city isn't properly established as a place of government administration until the changes of AD 52, when an orthogonal street layout, which you see on the left-hand side of this site, was laid out. And that layout is accompanied by attention to street systems, waterfront revetments where ships can be drawn up, and in particular to the construction of a large hard standing at the site that later became the Forum, just beneath where on this caption it says water pipe. There's a large construction built to accommodate the traffic coming through the city. And intriguing, the early evidence is that that traffic was more important than what was going on in terms of public architecture and the like. This takes me on to a situation where I've got half an hour at most to run through what happens to Roman London now it's been established. That is a case of 2 big fires and 2 possible recessionary events that I would like to associate with plagues, and I shall have to run through the evidence for those pretty briskly. The first of these great fire events is that of AD 60-61, and that is dated by both historical sources and the dendrochronology. And in the wake of that fire, when the rebels descend on London in a revolt against the new provincial government, in the wake of that, we have the construction of new road systems around the site, the planting of a new fort on the site. We have waterworks associated with the building of new bathhouses, and we have the construction of major new quays on the riverfront, and some of those built over fragmented human remains, perhaps evidence of corpse abuse, again from the site at Regis House, and the new quays built there in AD 64. And at this date, London remains a site very much dominated by the provincial administration. We have all of the Bloomberg tablets attesting to the presence of the auxiliary forces brought in the wake of the revolt. And then in subsequent phases, we have some of these fascinating burials from London, but associated with the administration, the procurator's tomb from Tower Hill, top left here. Fascinating cemetery site. This is a lead urn from Warwick Square on display in the British Museum, but a stunning piece of burial material, which I suspect is another very high status official, perhaps where the governor himself might have been buried. We know of at least one governor who died in office in Britain in this date. Tacitus describes London still at this date as being famed for its involvement in supply, but not yet having, as far as we can tell, a formal title or status. So a city attached to the provincial administration. And this we see echoed by what's going on when Vespasian takes over the ruling of the empire after the year of 3 emperors in AD 69. And London sees very early investment from the new Flavian administration. The city is enlarged, and this massive new amphitheatre is built. The procurement exercise for which started in AD 70-71, as far as we can tell from the dendro, and a building complex completed in AD 74. And obviously, this initially timber structure, the masonry remains you see on the left from a later phase of rebuilding, but the initially timber structure obviously shows no direct comparison architecturally with the Colosseum, but it is intriguing that the chronology of its construction is very closely contemporary with that of the Colosseum. And that reflects on the fact that the amphitheatre was an important symbol of the way in which the early Flavian dynasty decided to represent itself, the use of it in celebrating the imperial cult, the use of it as a site of public execution, the identification of it as a place of public games in support of the new administration. And this does seem to have been part of a clear agenda of the Vespasianic period, and that clear agenda seeing reflection in London and demonstrating the importance of London to the new administration. Vespasian, of course, seeking to establish his credentials to rule by reflecting on the earlier Claudian conquest and, of course, more importantly, Caesar's conquest of Britain, or at least invasion of Britain, which was the model that all new emperors would seek to follow in the early dynasties. And London then goes through its period of rapid expansion following this early Flavian investment, and that involves the constructions of probably water mills, new bathhouses, and there is a connection between this investment in London, beautifully shown in this model that was until very recently on display in the Museum of London, but has now been mothballed and I fear may not be brought back for display. Fantastically beautiful model based on Gustav Milne's excavations at Pudding Lane and nearby, but I think captures very well that sense of the busyness of the port, the business of the river, and London's role as a transshipment point in bringing through the supplies needed on these various stages of campaign that are still going on throughout the early Flavian period and leading up importantly to Agricola's very temporary success at conquering the whole of Britain in Caledonia. And these early Flavian investments are carried on in both Trajanic and Hadrianic periods, and London is probably at the peak and its height in the Hadrianic period, which is when we see the completion of the Great Forum, now underneath Gracechurch Market. And again, an intriguing parallel can be drawn with the history of Trajan's Forum in Rome itself, in that the early phases of the Forum predate the Hadrianic completion and are quite likely to date the Trajanic period, but were completed by Hadrian. And this is exactly what happens with Trajan's Forum in Rome. So again, London is seeing imperial investment echoing what is going on elsewhere in the empire. That leads me to London at its peak, and I shall now briskly look at some of the problems that London faces as we go further forward. London is burnt to the ground in its second Great Fire, the first obviously being that of AD 60-61, circa AD 125. We've known about this for the best part of a century, and the dating is survived fairly robustly as belonging to circa AD 125, initially based on the study of Samian from the Regis House area. And there is evidence of rebuilding on the waterfront with dendrochronological dating of circa AD 127-128, which would seem to confirm that the fire has happened and revival is underway in the later 120s. Sorry, the slide on the left simply shows one of the little kitchen areas. You can see the very top of that slide above the mosaic is the collapsed bits of pottery debris in a burnt kitchen in excavations at Gresham Street. There are some arguments as to whether or not there are several fires of the Hadrianic period. I don't think that those fundamentally change the picture of a massive conflagration. And you can see in the map there the extent of fire debris of this period, filling out pretty much all of the then extent of the Flavian site. And I would argue there is a chance, it's very far from certain, that what we're seeing in circa AD 125 is sort of echoing what we'd seen in AD 60-61. The archaeological footprint, the archaeological cincture is very similar. We have the construction of a fort in the Hadrianic period. People have often argued it to be a base for the governor's bodyguard, but that would be a very unusual arrangement. It's not mirrored in most other sites in the Roman Empire. Whereas we do have the evidence of the fort being built in London in the immediate post-revolt period. Similarly, we had the construction of large new roads perhaps to improve troop movements in and around the site. We have historical documentary evidence for a war occurring in Britain in the Hadrianic period, and some have dated that to the period circa AD 124. No evidence that hits the southern part of the province, but then again, no evidence that it doesn't. And perhaps what we're seeing in London might reflect on that, and perhaps even one could argue that the same is true of the Classis Britannia fort at Dover. But that's a broader argument. But also what we have going on in the Hadrianic period is increased evidence of body fragmentation. And body fragmentation is where we have burials, well, not burials, where we have things that are not burials, which are bits of body parts strewn about, sometimes partly articulated, suggesting that they were strewn about from corpses that had not fully defleshed, and in other cases, quite clearly curated and reused bits of body parts, and in particular, crania. And this takes us on to the fascination, the mystery of the Walbrook skulls. Again, there are different arguments as to how and why all of these skulls end up being found in the upper reaches of the Walbrook River. The Walbrook River is this river that dissects the site of the Roman city on the north bank, a small tributary of the Thames. But in the headwaters of the Walbrook River, just outside the limits of the Flavian and Trajanic city, we have found, many archaeologists and construction workers have found water-rolled and water-stained crania. Over 300 are documented in published reports, and those published reports only touch on the numbers that have been found. Given how little has actually been excavated of the headwaters of the Walbrook, it seems likely that there will be thousands of skulls once present in that area. And although these date from different periods, and I'm not arguing for a single event generating all of this evidence, there is a peak skull period in the Hadrianic period where we have good dating evidence for the skulls, the crania. And some of these crania are shown in the slide here. This is from the construction of the Crossrail connection site at Liverpool Street, and the Museum of London excavations there for Crossrail found that some of these water-rolled skulls had been presumably lifted from parts of the Walbrook for reburial purposely. They were detached from their jawbones. They were not associated with a rich array of other human bones, although some were present. And some had been placed in bags at intervals within ditches alongside this wide road with possible military uses. What's fascinating about these skulls is that only 4 were sent in for isotopic analysis because of the cost of the exercise and as a small sample. And of those 4, 2 were from individuals who had grown up with very unusual granitic geology backgrounds. And those granite-like sites are not present at all in southern Britain, but are found in some other locations, Massif Central, in Scandinavia, perhaps in bits of Ireland, but also in the Highlands of Scotland. And quite how it is that a sample of only 4 that were looked at, 2 of them share this unusual isotopic background seems really quite remarkable. Another group of these skulls came out of a pit where it had been clear that the individuals concerned had had their faces smashed in and been very aggressively treated as the bodies were dismembered and the skulls thrown into these pits. And this fits with the idea of corpse abuse, which was a sadly not uncommon practice in antiquity, as the dead are being denied the chance of proper burial because the dead are particularly detested. And so there's no clear evidence that this relates to a Hadrianic war, but the combination of things I've just discussed suggests to me that the warfare is one reasonable case, plausible case for the evidence that we've found. And I've now given myself, as ever, so little time for all of the exciting things that happen thereafter. I'd warned you that might be the case. We have 2 intriguing periods of what could be termed recessionary activity in London. Both of them are difficult to pin down archaeologically because construction activity provides lots of good dendrochronological dates and lets us describe periods of change. When things stop happening, obviously such evidence is harder to come by, and that makes chronologies and indeed the detail of change difficult to unpick. The first of these potentially recessionary episodes is evidenced by the abandonment of some buildings and some sites in the built-up area. The slide on the right shows my recent attempt to identify sites where we can prove there is continuity of domestic activity through the 2nd century, and those are marked by the black circles, and sites where there appears to be an interruption in that domestic activity, and those are marked by the crossed circles. And this gives us a site where there's evidence perhaps of contraction in many parts of town, certainly in the western part of the city and in the area around the Cripplegate Fort, the Hadrianic Fort I've mentioned earlier on, which doesn't seem to have remained in occupation into the later 2nd century. The dating of these changes seems to be around the 160s. This is when we have pottery kilns ceasing production. And this is also more notably when we start running out of dendrochronological dates. Given that drains were being repaired regularly, waterfronts were being repaired regularly, when those regular repairs cease to happen, that might be argued to provide a date for when other recessionary activities are going on. And that points again to a date in the 160s. If we were looking at contraction on that scale, we're not talking about abandonment. We're not talking about London ceasing to be a populous centre. Estimates of the site in the Hadrianic period have suggested a population of 30 to 35,000. These are very broad estimates. A contraction of the level indicated by the map you see on the right, 57% contraction, would simply bring population down to 10 to 15,000. That's roughly akin to what we think London had as a population in the Boudiccan Neronian period, and would still make it the most populous site in Britain. So contraction isn't the same as abandonment, and obviously we see continuity of activity of various sorts in various locations. One possible cause of that contraction, and it was Harvey Sheldon who first drew our attention to it on a long list, I have to point out, of other possible causes of that contraction, is that of the plague of Galens, a plague known to have swept through the Roman world in the 160s. The scale of that plague, the extent of mortality, are matters of intense dispute and debate between ancient historians and demographers, and I shan't attempt to get caught up with any of those details. I would simply point out that in addition to London's rapid contraction, because it is relatively rapid, we're happy within a decade, in addition to trying to account for where that contraction might happen, we have two possible sets of evidence that plague concerned Londoners at the time. One of them is less than certain, but is based on work by Rafe Merrifield, who identified several sculptures that appear to be part of an archer god cult. And of course, Apollo is the most famous of archers and was the sower of plague and the god that people turned to worrying about plague. And Rafe describes this archer god cult as potentially linked to the plague of Galens. And you see one of the relevant statues on the left. And then more recently, work on the Thames foreshore found an amulet which contained a magical spell that used the exact words found in an oracle that reported on the prophylactics to use against plague that was used elsewhere in the Roman Empire. And that was found on the Thames foreshore as well. We don't have any dead people from this plague. We can't prove that anybody actually died of this plague in London, but we can show that at least one person was sufficiently fearful of it to have worn and then perhaps ritually deposited this amulet in the waters of the Thames. And when you come back to my argument about London having had this important role as a place of transshipment, the port being such a busy part of the city, obviously plague events have a serious impact on manpower. Not necessarily that people die, but that people don't particularly fancy turning up for work in populous cities where plague is a risk. And the ability of Rome to command the manpower needed, the intense manpower needed for manhandling goods from boats into storage areas, onto the wagons, and then carriage on to elsewhere in the province. These sorts of labour-intensive activities are imperiled by fear of plague. And this is perhaps a model to explain the 2nd century contraction. London, a generation later, is revived. And I won't go into the fascinating history of that revival, but there is evidence that this is again influenced by military campaigns through the dates we now have for elements of the waterfront reconstruction that occurs in the late 2nd and early 3rd century. And this may in turn lead into the construction of London's town walls, perhaps associated with reforms to the provincial administration under Caracalla. And there is some dating evidence that points in that direction, again, not certain. London in the 3rd century is still busy. It still has important activities going on, the Temple of Mithras being one of the more obvious cases. But then again, London hits further problems in the mid to late 3rd century. And this, I also suggest, is just possibly associated with another documented plague event. The main evidence for this is the way in which London's waterfront is destroyed, basically. That the Trevor Brigham's study of the late Roman waterfronts in London showed that the timbers of the revetments along the waterfront had been chopped away. Timbers had been cut back and a bank formed. And this clearly shows a redundancy of the port in the sense that you no longer have the quays on which to unload goods. But it also has the look and feel of being defensive in nature. So we can certainly say that the port is becoming largely redundant at this date. I say this date, I'll come to dating in a second. And we also have significant contraction in what we know of long distance trade through supplies of amphora containing oil and wine. And we also know of major changes in the wider landscape around London. This is the likely date for interruptions to some of the larger ironworking sites in the Wealden. And that ironworking had certainly in part been supporting fleet activities. And I suspect that some of the northern Wealden ironworking sites were supplying iron for use in Southwark, where things like shipbuilding may well have been taking place. When does this happen? Well, again, we're back in the fact that you can't date the destruction of a waterfront. It doesn't have the evidence we need. What we can date are when people were still building waterfronts. And we know the latest dendro-dated waterfront dates to AD 241, although that is from the south of the river. And we also have what we know about timber procurement in London. And there is a gap in timber procurement after circa AD 252. Yes, I thought I might be getting to that point. And there are various potential causes as to why London should have seen these significant changes in the mid-3rd century. But the heading to this particular slide tells us that these are dated broadly to the period of what is described as the 3rd century crisis, a term disputed by some, but which I find still kind of fits the bill. And there are various things going on, such as the breakaway Gallic Empire, such as Frankish piracy, which might help account for why we have a defensive bank. But what we do know is that the plague of Cyprian is documented in circa 253. Bishop of Carthage is writing about it. And the chronology is quite neatly tying in with what we know in London is going on in terms of people ceasing to procure new timbers for constructions in London. And the plague of Cyprian itself could partly account for elements of political crisis and elements of failure to maintain security over the seas, and things like Frankish piracy may be filling vacuums left by manpower crises at this time. These are arguments several steps removed from what's going on in London, but London's dating evidence becomes a useful contribution to how some of those arguments might be further explored and taken forward. I won't go into how London is then revived in later antiquity, but revived it is, but revived as a very different kind of city, a base for political authority. And as a base for political authority, we do see construction activities dating to periods of increased administrative interest in the province. Some of those can perhaps be related to known historical events. This is more dangerous because the dating evidence gets thinner. But we do know that the decline in London is setting in well before the end of the 4th century. And when I say decline, that too is a disputed term, but we have some quite important markers of change, which I would like to see as still meriting the term decline of some sort. One of those is that when coin supply fails, and it did so at various points in the Roman administration, that coin supply failure was not accompanied by the creation of local copies. And in previous periods, they're called forgeries, but they're by and large, they're just the creation of small change for routine transactions, and often are likely to have been sanctioned by the military authorities in the province. Those local copies had always been needed because small change was needed for transactional activity. That doesn't appear to have been the case when coin supply fails in the later 4th century. And we also have other indicators of a failure of supply and networks of supply, in the sense that the roads themselves are no longer being looked after in quite the same way. And indeed, we have quarry pits dug into road surfaces in both Southwark and on the road leading into the western part of the city, where people were quarrying gravel for other building activities. So people are still here, but they weren't interested in maintaining road traffic. Ox-laden carts would have struggled to bump their way across these quarry pits loosely backfilled that have been dug into the gravel surfaces. And we have other evidence of change, which I have denied myself the time to describe, as I feared I would. But we can identify a reduced role in London's administrative functions in late antiquity. And that is in large part because London, after its late 3rd century reinvention, had become not a place of economic activity, not a place of transshipment of goods and supply, not managing mega import of amphora and the like, but simply as a walled administrative enclave where officials sat, treasury officers were based, where military leaders would occasionally base themselves when campaigns were necessary. And all of that ceases to happen as the attention of those competing for power in their own world start shifting their attention eastwards, as Trier loses its role as in administration. And so London is in serious trouble as a place of busy activity in the late 4th century. And that then leads into a period where by the 5th century, the city itself is seeing minimal, if any, activity. But what is fascinating is the evidence for continuity we have in the landscape around London. London as an administrative enclave is perhaps less important, but many of those farmsteads, some of which we can trace back to the late Iron Age, do potentially carry on in activity into the 5th century. And the best evidence of that comes from St. Martin's in the Fields, which I mentioned earlier on, sitting next to Trafalgar Square, where we do have evidence that appears to suggest that people are producing tiles to repair roofs or baths as late as the early 5th century, based perhaps on a villa site, and we have sarcophagi found from the site. And I'm probably going to have to run to a quick conclusion, but we have evidence also of some of the earlier Saxon activity and latest antique activity occurring on sites outside the area of the town walls, and X's mark the spots on that map of recent discoveries. Fascinatingly, only one within the city walled area, but quite a few outside of it. So rural continuities, because that rural landscape was less linked to the political authorities based in London, who were very empire dependent. And so my model for Roman London is a city so closely tied to the imperial administration that it has no function when the imperial administration ceases to care to administer Britain because it's too busy with its concerns elsewhere. And I summarize those points here in a slide that I won't talk to, because otherwise you won't get any questions in. And Jane, I'm so sorry I rabbited on too long. My apologies to you all, but at least I've got to an end of sorts.
That was absolutely brilliant, Dominic. No, not at all. I think possibly we should have booked you for several slots. We should perhaps have had the early bit and then the later bit and the sort of rise and decline of fall. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And have all sorts of things rattling around my brain about dead bodies and mistreating bodies and where these granitic people are coming from. But do we have questions? We don't have anything yet in the Q&A box. We have got people raising hands. If you can type in the Q&A box, if that works for you. I'm unsure, you see, whether Peter, John and Kevin have questions or have raised their hands accidentally. We will just see what comes in. I will also note while I'm here that Dominic has been nominated for Book of the Year for Current Archaeology, and the link to vote for that is in the chat. And obviously the book is available through the publisher, Oxford University Press, and all other good and slightly cheaper booksellers. So do feel free to have a think about that. Right, we have some questions coming in. Tom Brearley, by anona, do you mean a dole or tax in kind?
Oh, there's an interesting set of good questions. There is a distinction that can be drawn between supplies. So I'm going to start again. What I mean in this case is an Annonary-like supply of grain that is coming in to supply the Roman forces. In late antiquity, we have evidence of a military annona where they have institutionalized such supplies throughout the Roman armed forces throughout the empire. In the early empire, we don't know how such supplies are being organized. I draw an analogy with the annual supply of foodstuffs described as the annona, and I think it is a good analogy. We have a lot of evidence in London for grain storage. We have the evidence of these water mills that are probably for grinding into bread. And the volume of goods coming through London isn't simply to feed London's population. A lot of these goods find their way elsewhere in the province. And I think that there is an annonary role, as it were. And that by that, I mean annual supply of goods, primarily for the 4 legions, but also supporting the administration. How much of that was being driven by the needs of individual soldiers being met by their private purchases, and how much of it was being supplied to them officially, is a very difficult matter to resolve. Some of it, however, must have been supplied when forces were on campaign as supplies. You are not going to have soldiers being sent off to deal with major campaigning activities without knowing they will be fed throughout those campaign activities. You would quickly find rebellious soldiers on your hands and problems in store. So you wouldn't expect them to pop into the local shop and buy their needed oil, wine and grain. You would expect that to be part of military campaign supplies. And the issue there is how far is that converted and into a structured, regulated supply. But given that campaigns were occurring pretty much continuously, not quite, but pretty much from AD 43 through to AD 83, you've got 40 years of substantial administered supply going on. Sorry, that was a long answer. And there's
that's a very comprehensive answer.
No,
Hopefully...
far from comprehensive. There's a whole range of questions that my answer begs that I'm not going to go into.
I think Tom, read the book. And Tom also says, fantastic talk, by the way. Right, Kevin Flood. Why don't you mention Richard Coates's name for London?
Well, that is one of the arguments, and I have been cautious about the different arguments that are out there. I'm going to temporarily struggle to remember the first name of Bynon, who wrote the more recent paper on the etymology of the place name of Roman London, Londinium, and that it being on the margins of well, it's beyond my knowledge really. I simply have reverted to the latest authoritative sounding paper. I accept that no one is fully agreed on the origins, on the exact etymology and exact basis of the name for Londinian, apart from the fact that it's clearly a loan word from Celtic.
Brilliant. Right, Peter Marsden, another legend of London archaeology. Congratulations, Dominic. Brilliant book too. Lots to consider. Please can we have a talk about the later Roman period? Any thoughts about why late Roman London was called Augusta?
None to compete with those that you yourself have advanced and others before me, because we don't know exactly when the name was introduced. And there are various episodes of political interference in Britain that might have caused it to come into being. I would have to revert to my notes, I'm afraid, to remember the exact chronology of it. And you, Peter, are probably better placed than I to remember that chronology. The key thing there is that up until the 70s, I suspect London had no official status. I think that around about the Agricolan period, it may have gained such status because of the construction of the early Flavian Forum. We have textual evidence that it didn't have, it appears not to have had its own magistrates into the 70s from the Bloomberg scripts. But your work on the forum provides the dating that we still, I think, abide by and worship in terms of dating the Flavian Forum. But we know that there's the Hadrianic Forum representing a major political change. So does that introduce a period when its status might have changed, perhaps to Colonia, or that would predate the grant of the Augusta title? But we then need to look at what's going on in the later periods, and in particular, these periods of revival after these plague events I've tentatively identified. And both of those periods of revival, in the late 2nd century and in the late 3rd century, both of those might have occasioned changes in the status of the site. And also so I'm floundering a bit. I'm not giving you an answer because I don't know better than you, Peter.
Brilliant. I think we should note here that Peter Marston has many books available covering detail of Roman London, and they are also available to purchase. One final question from Catherine Chamorro. If the decline of London started before the Romans left Britain, does this explain why the remaining locals, Romano-British, chose to abandon it and move their centre east rather than rebuild?
I don't think it quite works that way. What we have is a period in which urban centres do not appear to have been part of the political agenda. And the dating of when that comes in does depend on our dating of the failure of the Roman administration. That Roman administration fails in steps and stages. We have periods when Britain is outside the orbit of Rome's control, periods when it's reintroduced that orbit, dating from the 380s through until circa 410, although that's an over-hard date in history. As the city loses those administrative functions, there is no evidence that it serves an economic role. There is no evidence that it serves a manufacturing role. There is no evidence that it actually has any role apart from its political role. Attached to that political role is, however, a potential role as the center for organized Christianity. And that's where we get into trouble, because we know very little about what organized Christianity is doing in late antiquity. London almost certainly would have had a bishop. There is a building tentatively identified as a cathedral. There is, from that, a legacy of a Christian identified episcopal role that follows through into what happens when St. Augustine is re-establishing Christianity, and when we've got the return of the Roman Church in the early 7th century. But in that gap, I don't think there is any need for London. And the development of Londonwick to the west of the site of the city is a later and separate initiative, although intriguingly develops around a potential site of political power. And of course, we've already been mentioning 5th century continuities at the site near Trafalgar Square. So we've got perhaps something around which that later segment develops. But my knowledge of what's going on in Londonwick and then into Londonburg are inferior to those of many people attending this lecture, and so I won't danger too far into that territory.
Brilliant, thank you for that. We've had one last question, which looks slightly complicated. We are slightly over time. Dominic, if I can just ask if this is too complicated. It's from anonymous attendee. The evidence of the AD 43 fort depends on ankle breakers, but there are the 3 that you mentioned. I'm not sure that they were necessarily ankle breakers.
There are ankle breakers in the ditches at the Walbrook. The argument has nothing to do with ankle breakers. Ankle breakers can feature in ditches dug for a myriad purposes, usually by people with some understanding of Roman military engineering, but you don't have to be a Roman to understand it. There are ways in which those ideas can be transmitted to other people. So the ankle breaker is not what defines those ditches as being associated with a potential Claudian encampment. What identifies those as being associated with a potential Claudian encampment is their location, is their early date. We don't have a precise date though, but also the lack of any other evident raison d'etre for the construction of such a large double-ditched enclosure. And the double ditch is actually more important than the angle breaker in a sense, because the idea of a smaller outer ditch and a larger inner ditch is a feature of defended enclosures and doesn't mean these ditches could be seen as roadside ditches or embracing some other form of enclosure. So it's date, and it's the broader topography, and then the context. It's not the angle breaker itself that pins it down.
Brilliant.